there is a name that has echoed across 8 centuries of history, carried forward not merely by scholars and chronicles, but by something older and more instinctive than scholarship. A name that conjures the image of a man on horseback, armored and unafraid, riding toward the horizon of a world on fire. That name is Richard. Richard, first of his name as King of England. Richard, Duke of Aquitaine, Count of Anjou, Lord of Cyprus, and conqueror of a dozen fortresses that lesser men had declared unconquerable. Richard the Lionheart. He lived for only 41 years. He ruled England for a decade. And yet, the weight of his legend has never grown light. To understand Richard, you must first understand the world that made him, because it was not a gentle world, and it did not produce gentle men. He was born on the 8th of September, 1157, in Oxford, England, the third son of one of the most turbulent royal marriages in medieval history. His father was Henry II of England, a king of iron will and volcanic temper. His mother was Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman so formidable, so politically sharp, so culturally refined, that historians still struggle to contain her within a single description. Eleanor was Queen of France before she was Queen of England. She went on crusade before Richard was born. She outlived her husband, outlived most of her children, and governed with a skill that most men of her era could only envy. Richard was her favorite, and from her, he inherited everything that mattered. He grew up in the courts of southern France, in Aquitaine, in Poitiers, absorbing the poetry of troubadours, the customs of chivalry, and the practice of war. By the age of 16, he was commanding armies, not observing, not assisting, commanding. He put down rebellions in his own duchy with a ferocity and tactical intelligence that left even seasoned commanders unsettled. He was not the kind of prince who waited for a crown to give him authority. He simply moved, and others followed, or moved out of the way. By the time Richard became King of England in 1189, following his father's death, a death Richard had, in part, hastened by siding with the King of France against his own father in the final conflict of Henry's reign. He had already spent more of his life in France than in England. He had already proven himself on the battlefield. He had already become, in the minds of his contemporaries, something closer to a force of nature than a man. England to Richard was a treasury and a title. It was the crusade that owned his heart. And what a crusade it was. In 1187, the great Muslim general Saladin had recaptured Jerusalem from the Christian powers that had held it for nearly 90 years. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. The shock of that news rolled across Europe like a wave. Pope Gregory VIII called it divine punishment. Kings wept, and Richard, then still a prince, took the cross, the vow of a crusader, before his own father did. That single gesture tells you everything about the man. He was always first, always forward, always leaning into the fire rather than away from it. When he finally departed for the Holy Land in 1190, as king now, leading what would become known as the Third Crusade, he did so with a fleet, an army, and a reputation that had already preceded him into legend. Along the way, he conquered Cyprus in a matter of days after its ruler made the mistake of mistreating shipwrecked English sailors. He did not plan to take Cyprus. He simply could not tolerate the insult. And once engaged, he was virtually unstoppable. At the siege of Acre, pinned down in a brutal campaign that had already exhausted the forces of 2 other kings, Richard arrived, reorganized, and broke the city open within 5 weeks. At the Battle of Arsuf, marching his forces down the coast of the Holy Land, with Saladin's cavalry hammering at them from the flanks, Richard held his army in check with almost superhuman discipline, absorbing blow after blow, waiting for the precise moment, and then unleashed a charge that shattered Saladin's forces and left even his enemy privately marveling at his command. Saladin, a man not given to empty flattery, called Richard the greatest warrior of the age. In an era defined by war, that was not a small thing to say. But Richard was not merely a fighter. He was a strategist, a diplomat when he needed to be, a poet in 3 languages, and a man of contradictions deep enough to fill this entire documentary. He was capable of breathtaking mercy and chilling ruthlessness within the same campaign. He was adored by his soldiers and feared by his enemies. He inspired songs while he lived and myths after he died. And he died as he lived, in the middle of a siege, struck by a crossbow bolt, unbowed to the very last. This is his story, and we have all the time in the world to tell it. There is a particular kind of education that no classroom can provide. It lives in the cold of an open field before dawn, in the weight of a decision that cannot be unmade, in the moment when the men around you look to you, not because you hold a title, but because something in your bearing tells them that you are the one who knows what to do next. Richard of Aquitaine received that education early. Younger than most men when they first draw a sword in earnest, older than his years in almost every way that counted. To understand how he became who he was, you must spend some time in the south of France. Not the France of Paris and cold northern courts, but the France of Aquitaine. A vast, sun-warmed duchy stretching from the Loire River down to the Pyrenees, rich with vineyards and Roman roads and a culture entirely its own. This was Eleanor's land. She had inherited it, governed it, loved it with a fierce possessiveness that even 2 marriages to powerful kings could not dilute. And when Richard was still a small boy, she brought him here. Away from England, away from his father's thunderous court, into the warmth of the south, where the air smelled of lavender and horses and old stone, and where the values that shaped him were not merely military. They were poetic, chivalric, almost philosophical in their complexity. Eleanor's court at Poitiers was unlike anything else in 12th century Europe. It was a place where troubadour poets competed for favor alongside knights, where the ideals of courtly love were not merely sung about but debated, codified, and taken seriously as a moral framework. Richard absorbed all of it. He was, by every account that survives, genuinely gifted, not just as a fighter, but as a composer. He wrote poetry and songs in both Occitan and French, and at least 2 of his compositions have survived the long erosion of the centuries. This was not a man who wore culture as an affectation. It ran through him alongside the blood. But Aquitaine also had a harder lesson to teach. It was, for all its beauty, a deeply fractious place. The great noble families of the duchy, the lords of Périgord, the counts of Angoulême, the barons of the Limousin, were proud, quarrelsome, and constitutionally resistant to outside authority. They had tolerated Eleanor because she was one of them, blood and bone. Her son was another matter. And so Richard's introduction to governance was not a ceremonial one. It was a trial by fire that began almost the moment he was formally invested as Duke of Aquitaine in 1172 at the age of 14. He was not yet 15 when he began to understand that authority in this part of the world was not granted. It was taken, held, and constantly defended. The rebellions came in waves. In 1173, barely 2 years after Richard received his duchy, he found himself caught inside one of the most dramatic family ruptures of the medieval age. His brothers, Henry the young king and Geoffrey, rose in rebellion against their father, King Henry II, resentful of his iron grip on their futures and his refusal to grant them any real power. Eleanor herself, their mother, supported the revolt. Richard joined it. He was 16 years old, already calculating, already committed to the idea that Aquitaine was his, and that his father's interference in it was not something he intended to tolerate indefinitely. The rebellion failed. Henry II, formidable as ever, crushed it with the kind of decisive authority that had defined his reign. Eleanor was captured and placed under house arrest, a confinement that would last in various forms for the next 15 years. Richard, young enough to be forgiven, was reconciled to his father and returned to his duchy. But the experience had not chastened him. If anything, it had sharpened him. He had seen how quickly alliances could form and dissolve, how swiftly fortune could turn, and how essential it was to be the most capable man in any room when the moment of decision arrived. Over the following years, Richard threw himself into the governance of Aquitaine with a focus that bordered on obsession. He built, he taxed, he negotiated, and when negotiation failed, which it did repeatedly, because the barons of Aquitaine respected only one language above all others, he besieged. Castle after castle fell to him in the late 1170s and early 1180s. He developed, in this period, the technical military knowledge that would later astound the armies of the Holy Land. He studied fortifications the way a scholar studies texts, understanding their weaknesses, their stress points, the geometry of their defenses. He became, arguably, the finest siege commander of his generation before he had turned 25. There is one campaign from this period that deserves particular attention because it reveals something essential about Richard that goes beyond raw ability. In 1179, he set his sights on the castle of Tilburg, a fortress so naturally defended, so layered in stone, and positioned so precisely above the river Charente, that it had come to be regarded as essentially impregnable. Previous attempts to take it had ended in humiliation. The lords who held it had grown comfortable behind that reputation, comfortable enough to be careless. Richard was never careless. He approached Tilburg not with overwhelming force, but with patience and precision. He devastated the surrounding lands, systematically, methodically, cutting off the castle's supply lines and stripping away any possibility of relief. When the moment was right, he moved fast. The assault lasted 3 days. The fortress that generations had called unconquerable fell to a 21-year-old duke who had decided with characteristic simplicity that it was going to fall. The effect on Aquitaine's nobility was electric. Some submitted immediately. Others held out a little longer, but not much. The message had been delivered in the only dialect they understood. His relationship with his father during these years was one of the defining tensions of his life. Henry II was not a man who loved easily, and the love he did offer came wrapped in control. He used his children as political instruments, betrothing them, promising them lands and titles, then withholding those promises when it suited him. Richard watched his older brother, Henry the young king, grow bitter and hollow under this treatment. Crowned King of England in his father's lifetime, given the title and none of the power, reduced to an allowance and a ceremonial existence, Richard was determined not to suffer the same fate, where his brother grew resentful and ultimately reckless, dying young, in 1183, of a fever contracted during yet another futile rebellion. Richard grew strategic. He played his father's game with more skill than his father anticipated. He made concessions when he needed to. He appeared cooperative, and all the while he held Aquitaine with a grip that Henry could never quite loosen. When his father, in 1184, attempted to pressure Richard into surrendering Aquitaine to his younger brother John, the future King John, already showing the slippery character that would define his reign, Richard refused, flatly, without negotiation. He returned home to Aquitaine, began fortifying his castles, and made it abundantly clear that any attempt to remove him from his duchy by force would be met with the kind of resistance that Henry would find expensive. Henry backed down. That moment mattered, because it established once and for all that Richard was not a piece on his father's board. He was a player in his own right, and as the 1180s wore on, as the news from the Holy Land grew darker, and the call of the crusade grew louder in his chest, Richard began to orient himself towards something larger than the politics of family and duchy. He had proven himself in Aquitaine. He had mastered the craft of war in the complicated, rain-soaked, rock-faced campaigns of southwestern France. He was ready in every sense for a grander stage. When the news reached him in 1187 that Saladin had taken Jerusalem, that the city toward which every Christian in Europe directed some portion of their devotion had fallen, Richard did not wait for papal proclamations or royal councils to tell him what to do. He took the cross that same autumn, before his father, before the King of France, before almost anyone else of his rank. There was no hesitation. There was never any hesitation with Richard once his mind was made up. The holy city had fallen, and he was, by his own understanding of himself, exactly the kind of man the moment required. Aquitaine had made him. The crusade would define him, and the road to Jerusalem was just beginning. There is something almost incomprehensible, from the vantage point of the modern world, about what it meant to go on crusade. Not the ideology of it, that has been examined and debated at length, and we will give it its proper weight, but the sheer physical undertaking, to leave your home, your lands, your court, everything familiar and controllable, and commit yourself to a journey of thousands of miles across open sea and hostile terrain, toward a war in a climate your body had never experienced, with no certainty of return. Men of all classes did this. Knights and peasants, merchants and monks. They sold their possessions. They kissed their families. They sewed a cross of cloth onto their tunics, and they walked toward the horizon. Richard did not walk. He sailed, but the scale of what he assembled before he sailed speaks to something fundamental about how he approached every undertaking. He did not do things halfway. He did not dabble. When Richard committed, the commitment was total, and the preparation was meticulous. By the time his fleet departed in the summer of 1190, he had spent the better part of a year liquidating assets and raising funds on a scale that scandalized even his supporters. Offices were sold, lands were leased. He famously remarked, with the dry candor that occasionally surfaced beneath his warrior's exterior, that he would have sold London itself if he could find a buyer. The treasury was stripped. The machinery of English and Angevin governance was essentially converted into a war chest, because Richard understood, with the clarity of a man who had besieged enough castles to know how sieges end, that a crusade without money was not a crusade. It was a pilgrimage with delusions. He traveled south through France, gathering forces, meeting with Philip II of France, his longtime ally, occasional enemy, and perpetual political complication. The two kings had agreed to go together, an arrangement that was convenient in theory and deeply uneasy in practice. Philip was clever, patient, and resentful of Richard in the way that careful men often resent brilliant ones, sensing that no matter how shrewdly he maneuvered, Richard had a quality he could not match and could not quite name. They were not friends. They were partners of necessity, and both of them knew it. The fleet that Richard commanded was vast, over 100 ships, carrying soldiers, horses, supplies, siege equipment, and the accumulated resources of a kingdom turned inside out in service of a single purpose. They sailed from Marseille and Messina, weathered the unpredictable temper of the Mediterranean, and then, in the spring of 1191, something happened that was not in any plan, but which revealed Richard's nature more clearly than almost any battle he would ever fight. A storm scattered part of his fleet near the island of Cyprus. Several of his ships were wrecked or driven ashore. Among the survivors taken in by the Cypriot shore were some of Richard's men, and, critically, his betrothed, Berengaria of Navarre, along with his sister Joan. The ruler of Cyprus at the time was a man named Isaac Komnenos, a self-declared emperor of uncertain legitimacy and entirely certain arrogance. who had broken away from Constantinople and ruled the island as his personal domain. Isaac refused to release the survivors. He seized the cargo from the wrecked ships. He reportedly treated the stranded passengers with deliberate contempt. This was a miscalculation of almost tragic proportions. Richard arrived off the Cypriot coast within days. He sent messengers requesting the release of his people and the return of his property. Isaac refused. And here is the detail that matters. Richard had not planned to take Cyprus. It was not on his itinerary. It was not part of the Crusade's strategic design. But when a man had wronged him and then refused to make it right, Richard's response was not diplomatic escalation. It was immediate, overwhelming military action, executed with the calm efficiency of a man who has decided that the conversation is over. He landed on Cyprus in May of 1191. Within days, Isaac's forces were broken in the field. Within 3 weeks, the entire island was under Richard's control. Isaac Komnenos surrendered personally, reportedly requesting only that he not be placed in iron chains. Richard, in a gesture that mixed mercy with a certain dry wit, had silver chains made for him instead. Cyprus was not merely a trophy. Richard understood its value immediately and completely. It was a supply base, a naval station, a place to rest and refit and resupply on the long line of communication between Europe and the Holy Land. He sold it, eventually, to the Knights Templar, and it would remain a Crusader stronghold for centuries after his departure. In 3 weeks, almost as a sideshow to his main purpose, he had permanently altered the strategic map of the Eastern Mediterranean. It is the kind of achievement that other commanders might have spent an entire career pursuing. He also, while in Cyprus, married Berengaria. It was a political union, arranged for the diplomatic value of the Navarrese alliance, and it was solemnized in the chapel of the castle of Limassol on the 12th of May, 1191. There was not much of a honeymoon. Richard's army was already preparing to sail for the coast of the Holy Land. There was a city waiting to be taken. That city was Acre. The siege of Acre had been grinding on for nearly 2 years before Richard arrived. The Christian forces, a collection of European crusaders who had reached the Holy Land ahead of him, along with the remnants of the old Crusader kingdom, had been besieging the city since 1189, but the siege had stalled into something exhausting and demoralizing. Saladin's army held the surrounding hills, pressing on the besiegers from the outside while the city's garrison held firm within. The Crusaders were caught between 2 forces, hungry, disease-ridden, their commanders quarreling, their momentum long since dissipated into the mud and heat of a campaign that seemed to have no end in sight. Then Richard's fleet appeared on the horizon. The effect, by every account, was immediate. Men who had been hollow with fatigue stood straighter. The arrival of the English king, already famous, already spoken of in terms that blurred the line between man and myth, changed something in the atmosphere of the camp that went beyond the practical reinforcement of supplies and soldiers. Richard brought with him a quality that is difficult to name without sounding theatrical, but which every military historian who has studied the period acknowledges: the sense that the situation had changed, because the man who was now in charge of it was simply different from the men who had been struggling with it before. He was ill when he arrived. A disease called Arnaldia, possibly a form of scurvy, or perhaps a fever caught during the sea crossing, had left him weakened, his hair reportedly falling out, his body running down. He conducted the siege from a litter at times, directing operations while unable to stand. It did not slow him meaningfully. He brought with him siege engines, tremendous mechanical catapults, carefully disassembled for the voyage and now reassembled on the plain before Acre's walls. He reorganized the army's rotations so that the assault was continuous, sustained around the clock in shifts that never gave the garrison a moment to recover or repair. He personally supervised the placement of the machines. He is reported to have taken up a crossbow during one of the assaults, shooting from the front line, as if the title of king was simply insufficient description for what he was. The walls began to crumble. The garrison, which had held for 2 years against everything thrown at it, began to understand that this was different. Saladin launched assault after assault on the besieging army from the landward side, trying to break the pressure on the city. Richard's forces absorbed each attack and held. The discipline he imposed, the same discipline he had learned in the brutal baronial wars of Aquitaine, held the army together under conditions that would have dissolved lesser forces into chaos. On the 12th of July, 1191, 5 weeks after Richard's arrival, Acre surrendered. 2 years of stalemate ended in 5 weeks. The city fell. The harbor opened. The great port on the coast of the Holy Land was in Crusader hands, and the road toward Jerusalem, still distant, still uncertain, still guarded by one of the most formidable commanders the medieval world had ever produced, lay ahead. Richard rested for exactly as long as he needed to. Then he began to march. There is a particular kind of military genius that announces itself loudly, the cavalry charge that breaks a line, the siege that ends in a single dramatic assault, the bold gamble that pays off in one glorious moment. History tends to remember that kind of genius most readily because it makes for clean narratives and vivid images. But there is another kind, quieter and in many ways more impressive, that reveals itself not in moments of explosion, but in the long, grinding, unglamorous work of keeping men alive and functional under conditions specifically designed to destroy them. It is the genius of control, of patience, of knowing with absolute certainty when not to act. Richard demonstrated both kinds on the road south from Acre. The strategic objective was clear enough. Jerusalem lay inland to the southeast. But an army the size of Richard's could not simply march overland through the hills of the Holy Land without exposing itself to destruction. The terrain was too broken, the supply lines too vulnerable, the heat too punishing. Richard chose instead to march his army down the coast, keeping the sea on his right flank, where his fleet could sail alongside and resupply them continuously, and keeping his formation tight enough to present Saladin's cavalry with no easy opening on the landward side. It sounds, described simply, like a sensible plan. What it required in execution was something close to superhuman. Saladin had spent the years since his reconquest of Jerusalem building and refining one of the most effective armies in the Islamic world. His forces were fast, disciplined, and built around the mounted archer, the light cavalry who could strike at range and then vanish before a counterattack could be organized. They had broken Crusader armies before by doing exactly what they now attempted to do to Richard's column, riding in close, loosing arrows into the marching ranks, screaming and drumming to unsettle the horses, probing for a gap, waiting for someone to break formation and chase them. Because the moment you chased them, you were lost. You had broken the line. You had handed them the opening they needed to come around your flanks and cut you apart. Richard knew this. He had studied it. And so he did something that should not have been possible with an army of exhausted, grief-stricken, heat-hammered crusaders who had been marching for weeks in temperatures they were never bred for, being stung continuously by arrows, watching their comrades fall, listening to the relentless psychological assault of Saladin's drums and war cries. He made them hold. The march lasted from the 22nd of August to the 7th of September, 1191. Day after day, the column moved south along the coast, infantry on the landward side forming a walking wall of shields and crossbows, cavalry protected within, the whole formation grinding forward at a pace dictated by Richard's judgment rather than anyone's impatience or fear. The infantry were rotated in shifts so that no one section bore the assault continuously. The crossbowmen fired in sequences, maintaining pressure while their colleagues reloaded. The horses, critical, irreplaceable, were kept to the inside of the formation and protected at enormous cost to the men on the flanks. The casualties were real. Men died every day on that march. Arrows found gaps in armor and joints in shields. The heat killed as surely as the enemy. One account describes the column moving through such a density of spent arrows that the ground around them looked, from a distance, like a field of reeds. And still Richard held them. Still the line did not break. There were moments when it nearly did. On the 7th of September, approaching the forest of Arsuf, Saladin committed his forces more fully than he had at any previous point, sensing that the Crusaders were nearing the end of their endurance. The assault intensified dramatically. The Hospitallers, the warrior monks who formed the rear guard of Richard's column and had been absorbing the worst of the attacks for days, sent urgent messages to Richard, requesting permission to turn and charge. Richard refused. He knew the timing was not yet right. The moment had to be chosen, not seized in desperation. The Hospitallers held, barely. The pressure became extraordinary. The kind of pressure that does not merely test courage, but tests the very coherence of a man's identity. The ability to remain a disciplined soldier when every instinct in the body is screaming to turn and fight back with everything available. And then, finally, Richard gave the signal. 2 trumpet blasts. The pre-arranged command that every man in the army had been told to wait for. That Richard had drilled into them in the days before the march, precisely because he knew this moment was coming, and he needed them to respond to a signal rather than to emotion. What happened next was, by the accounts of witnesses on both sides, breathtaking. The Crusader cavalry turned as one, not in ragged desperation, but in coordinated, explosive formation, and launched a charge of such sudden and overwhelming force that Saladin's cavalry, caught in the middle of an attack rather than prepared for a countercharge, had no time to dissolve and regroup in their usual fashion. The impact was devastating. The Muslim line broke. Saladin's forces, so effective at fluid harassment and retreat, found themselves unable to reorganize quickly enough to prevent the charge from driving deep into their formation. The Battle of Arsuf lasted the rest of that afternoon. Saladin attempted multiple times to reform and counterattack, and each time Richard's forces met the attempt with controlled, organized response. By evening, Saladin's army had withdrawn. The field belonged to the Crusaders. The casualties on Richard's side were, by the brutal mathematics of medieval warfare, remarkably light. A few hundred dead against an enemy that had been pounding them for 2 weeks. Saladin's losses were significantly heavier. But the numbers, in some ways, are not the point. The point is what Arsuf demonstrated about Richard as a commander. He had imposed his will, not on the enemy, but on his own army. That is the harder achievement. Saladin was a brilliant man who would never underestimate Richard again after that afternoon. In his private correspondence, in the accounts passed down through his court, the picture that emerges is one of genuine respect, shaded with something that might almost be called frustration. He had done everything correctly. He had used the terrain, the climate, the psychological pressure of continuous assault. He had been patient. He had been disciplined. And the English king had simply been more disciplined still. The Crusader army reached Jaffa in the days following Arsuf and rested there, resupplied by the fleet, rebuilding its strength. Richard walked among his men. In those days, by all accounts, physically present in the camp rather than withdrawn behind the curtain of royal ceremony. He inspected the wounded. He spoke with his commanders. He was, in this as in so much else, a soldier's king, a man whose authority rested not on distance and mystique, but on the visible daily reality of his competence and his courage. Jerusalem was now, in strategic terms, within reach. The coastal road was controlled, the port of Jaffa was secured, the army had survived the march and won the field at Arsuf. And the momentum that had seemed impossible to recover during those dark weeks at Acre had been not merely restored, but transformed into something approaching genuine confidence. But the holy city was not simply a matter of distance. The road from the coast to Jerusalem ran through the Judean hills, broken, defensible ground, where Saladin's forces could make the Crusaders pay in blood for every mile. And Saladin, whatever he had lost at Arsuf, had not lost his army. He had not lost his intelligence. He had not lost his ability to think 3 moves ahead of an enemy he respected, but intended, nevertheless, to defeat by other means. The war was not over. In some ways, the most complicated part was just beginning. Richard had shown, on the road south, what he could do when the problem was primarily military, when the challenge was to hold men together and choose the right moment to strike. What lay ahead would test capacities that the battlefield could not fully prepare a man for. Politics, compromise, the infuriating gap between what is strategically possible and what the men beside you are willing to do. The city of Jerusalem glittered in the distance, just beyond the hills, and the king, who had never yet failed to take what he set out to take, found himself, for the first time, facing a problem that could not be solved by discipline and a perfectly timed cavalry charge. That problem would define everything that came next. There are moments in history when 2 men of extraordinary ability find themselves on opposite sides of the same conflict, and the collision between them produces something that transcends the war itself, something that neither side quite anticipated, and that neither side could fully explain afterward. The relationship between Richard and Saladin was that kind of collision, and it is one of the most fascinating and genuinely moving stories that the medieval world has left us, not least because the 2 men never once met face to face. Everything they knew of each other came through intermediaries, through messengers carrying letters across the lines, through the accounts of prisoners and defectors, through the evidence of each other's actions on the battlefield and at the negotiating table. And yet, from these fragments, something unmistakable emerges, a mutual recognition that cut through the religious and political architecture of the conflict and settled into something quieter and more personal. 2 men, shaped by entirely different worlds, looking across the lines at each other and seeing, with some surprise and perhaps some private discomfort, a reflection. Saladin, born Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub in 1137 in Tikrit, was in 1191 a man in his mid-50s, older than Richard by nearly 2 decades, and already carrying the weight of a career that had reshaped the political map of the Islamic world. He had united the fractious Muslim powers of Egypt and Syria under a single banner. He had defeated the Crusader armies at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 with a strategic elegance that military historians still study today. He had taken Jerusalem not with massacre and fire, as the First Crusade had taken it nearly a century before, but with a restraint and magnanimity that astonished even his enemies, allowing the Christian population to ransom themselves and depart in peace. He was, by temperament, a man who preferred resolution to destruction, wisdom to fury. He was also, make no mistake, completely committed to keeping Jerusalem. Richard understood this, and as the Crusader army rested at Jaffa in the autumn of 1191, as the first probing diplomatic contacts were made between the 2 camps, a strange and intricate dance began, part negotiation, part psychological contest, each man attempting to read the other through the imperfect medium of messengers and translated letters. Richard sent his own brother-in-law, Humphrey of Torun, to open talks with Saladin's representatives. Saladin sent his brother, Al-Adil, a man of great intelligence and considerable charm, to meet with Richard directly. These meetings were, by contemporary accounts on both sides, genuinely cordial. Richard and Al-Adil developed what appears to have been a real rapport, the kind of relationship that flourishes between intelligent people who recognize each other's quality even across a divide of competing loyalties. Richard proposed, at one remarkable point, that Al-Adil marry his sister Joan, the widowed Queen of Sicily, and that the 2 of them rule Jerusalem jointly under some form of shared sovereignty. It was an extraordinary proposal, possibly serious, possibly a sophisticated diplomatic probe designed to reveal what Saladin actually valued and what he was willing to concede. Joan, reportedly, was not consulted. She was furious when she found out. The proposal went nowhere, but it tells you something about the range of Richard's thinking, that he could conceive of such a solution at all, that his imagination, in the space between military campaigns, reached for possibilities that most of his contemporaries could not even have formulated as questions. Through the winter of 1191 and into 1192, the army twice marched toward Jerusalem. Twice Richard led them through the Judean hills, through the cold and the mud of a Palestinian winter that no one in his army had been prepared for, closing the distance to the holy city until it was almost within striking range. And twice he turned back. The reasons were military, and they were real. Jerusalem, sitting on its plateau in the Judean hills, was a defender's dream. Saladin had reinforced it massively, stripping garrisons from other cities to concentrate his strength there. Any assault would require a lengthy siege, and a lengthy siege conducted in the hills and cut off from the coast meant that Saladin's army, still intact, still dangerous, operating on familiar ground, could position itself between the Crusaders and their supply lines and slowly throttle the besieging force to death. Richard had seen at Acre what a siege looked like when it went wrong. He was not willing to reproduce that experience with Jerusalem, and he was not willing to take the city in a costly assault, only to find himself unable to hold it when the army, inevitably, because armies on crusade always went home, eventually, dissolved back toward Europe and left a garrison insufficient to defend what they had won. He polled his commanders. He assembled councils of war. The military consensus, reached with considerable anguish, was that the assault was not viable. Twice, the same conclusion, reached twice, after two separate approaches. The decision not to attack Jerusalem was, militarily, almost certainly correct. It was also, in human terms, devastating. The men who had marched from Acre, who had survived Asuf, who had endured the cold and the mud of the Judean hills, and who could see, from the ridgelines above the city, the outline of the place they had crossed, a continent and an ocean to reach. Those men were broken by the retreat in a way that no battle had broken them. There are accounts of knights who, when the order came to turn back, pulled their helmet visors down so that their comrades could not see them weep. There is one account, repeated in several chronicles, of Richard himself reaching a hilltop from which Jerusalem was briefly visible in the distance, and raising his shield to cover his eyes. Unable, he said, to look upon what he could not yet deliver. Whether or not that precise moment happened exactly as described, it captures something true about the emotional reality of that campaign. Richard was not a man who separated himself from the weight of what he was asking his army to carry. He felt it. He carried it alongside them. The negotiations with Saladin continued through the spring and summer of 1192, interrupted by bursts of military activity on both sides. Richard launched a brilliant operation to refortify Ascalon, the coastal city that controlled the southern approaches to Jerusalem, an operation conducted simultaneously with diplomatic contact and occasional skirmishes that kept Saladin off balance and unable to fully concentrate his forces. He took the town of Darum. He intercepted and destroyed a massive Saladin supply caravan in the desert, a tactical stroke that significantly degraded the resources available to the Muslim army. But the central problem remained unsolved. And then, in the summer of 1192, a new crisis emerged that forced Richard's hand in ways the battlefield never had. Word reached him from England, his brother John, the same John who had attempted to claim Aquitaine a decade earlier, the same John who would one day lose most of the Angevin Empire and sign Magna Carta under duress, was maneuvering at home. He was cultivating alliances. He was making arrangements that had the unmistakable character of a man preparing to claim a throne he did not yet hold. And Philip of France, who had left the crusade early, ostensibly due to illness, in reality due to the political calculation that Richard's absence from Europe was an opportunity too good to waste, was circling the edges of the Angevin territories with undisguised appetite. Richard could not stay. The kingdom he had stripped to fund this crusade was beginning, in his absence, to come apart. And so he negotiated. Through September of 1192, Richard and Saladin's representatives worked toward an agreement, the Treaty of Jaffa, signed on the 2nd of September, that gave the Crusaders control of the coastal cities, guaranteed Christian pilgrims safe access to Jerusalem, and established a 3-year truce between the two sides. It was not the liberation of the city. It was not what anyone had prayed for or marched toward. But it was real, and it was durable, and it was the best that the circumstances, military, political, logistical, actually permitted. On the day the treaty was signed, Saladin allowed a group of Christian pilgrims to enter Jerusalem and pray at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Richard did not go with them. He could not bring himself to visit the city as a pilgrim when he had come as a liberator. He stayed at the coast and waited for the ships that would carry him home. The two men exchanged final gifts. Saladin sent Richard fresh fruit and snow, an extravagance in that climate and season, delivered with the quiet grace that characterized everything the Sultan did. Richard sent back words of admiration that his chroniclers recorded with evident pride, as if the respect of such an enemy were itself a form of victory. In a way, it was, but it was also, unmistakably, a farewell. The crusade was over. Jerusalem remained in Saladin's hands, and the Lionheart turned his face toward the sea. There is something almost mythological about the journey home. The hero, having fought his war and made his peace, turns toward the familiar horizon, and the world, as if unwilling to release him so easily, reaches up one final time and pulls him back down. It happens in the oldest stories. It happened with a literalness that would have seemed excessive in fiction to Richard of England in the autumn and winter of 1192. He left the Holy Land on the 9th of October, sailing from Acre with a small fleet, and the accumulated exhaustion of 2 years of war pressed into every bone in his body. He was 35 years old. He had achieved something remarkable, and fallen short of something greater, and the particular weight of that combination, triumph and incompletion existing simultaneously, was not the kind of weight that a sea voyage easily dissolves. But the sea, in any case, was not feeling cooperative. Storms hit the fleet almost immediately. The ships were scattered. Richard found himself, by the time the worst of the weather had passed, separated from most of his escort and drifting in the Adriatic with a small number of vessels and a problem that went beyond navigation. The direct route home, through France, was closed to him. Philip of France, his former crusade partner and now undisguised rival, had made it known that Richard would not pass through French territory unmolested. The alternative routes through Europe required him to cross lands controlled by rulers who had, in varying degrees, reasons to wish him ill. The Holy Roman Empire was one such territory, and the man who governed the eastern reaches of it, Duke Leopold V of Austria, had a grievance against Richard that was personal, specific, and had been nursing quietly for over a year. The source of that grievance lay back at Acre. During the siege, Leopold had planted his banner on a section of the captured city's walls, claiming a share of the glory and, more practically, a share of the spoils. Richard, in a moment of high-handedness that was characteristic of his best and worst qualities simultaneously, had the banner torn down and thrown into a ditch. The insult to Leopold's honor was public and deliberate. Richard did not particularly care what Leopold of Austria thought of him. He was a king. Leopold was a duke. The hierarchy, in Richard's understanding of the world, was clear. But hierarchies have a way of reasserting themselves in unexpected circumstances. Richard attempted to cross Austria in disguise, traveling by various accounts as a merchant, or as a knight of no particular distinction. Moving through the countryside with a small group of companions, and hoping that the combination of winter weather and unremarkable appearance would carry him through to safer ground. It almost worked, but Richard was not a man who disappeared easily into crowds. He was physically large, notably handsome by the accounts of the period, and possessed of a manner that, even in plain clothes, communicated authority with an insistence that no disguise could entirely suppress. There are accounts suggesting that one of his companions, sent into a village market to purchase food, was found carrying a pair of fine gloves of unmistakably royal quality, the kind of detail that unraveled the entire fiction. He was recognized near Vienna in December of 1192 and taken into custody by Leopold's men. The news reached Europe like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of disbelief, then calculation, then, in certain quarters, poorly concealed satisfaction. Philip of France is said to have written to John in England with the kind of barely contained glee that speaks to how thoroughly he had abandoned whatever vestige of crusading brotherhood had once existed between them. Richard, he informed John, had been captured and was in the hands of the emperor. The implication was clear. The throne of England was, at least temporarily, a great deal more accessible than it had been a month ago. Leopold transferred his royal prisoner to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, a man whose relationship with the concept of mercy was, at best, theoretical. Henry recognized immediately that he was holding something of extraordinary value, and he intended to extract every possible advantage from the situation. Richard was moved to the castle of Dürnstein, perched above the Danube River in what is now Austria, and from there to Trifles Castle in Germany. Places chosen less for comfort than for security, though accounts suggest Richard was not treated with deliberate cruelty. He was a king after all, and kings, even captive ones, retained a certain status that even the most rapacious jailer was reluctant to entirely discard. There is a legend, almost certainly embellished, possibly invented, but too beautifully constructed to pass over without mention, that Richard's loyal troubadour, Blondel de Nesle, wandered through Europe singing a song that only Richard would recognize, listening at the walls of castle after castle for the king's voice to complete the melody from within. It is the kind of story that the medieval imagination produced with great facility, and it tells you something about how Richard's captivity was understood by the people who lived through it, not as a straightforward political event, but as something closer to a folk tale, a test of loyalty and love. The hero imprisoned by darkness while those who loved him searched the world to find him. What actually happened was simultaneously less romantic and more extraordinary. Eleanor of Aquitaine, his mother, then in her 70s, by any measure one of the most remarkable human beings of the 12th century, essentially took charge of England and the response to her son's imprisonment with a focused energy that shamed men half her age. She raised money, she wrote letters, she managed the political threat posed by John's maneuvering with a firm hand, keeping the kingdom from fragmenting while simultaneously orchestrating the diplomatic and financial machinery required to free her son. Her letters to Pope Celestine III, imploring papal intervention, are among the most vivid documents of the period, written with the controlled fury of a woman who has spent her life navigating the indifference of powerful men and is not prepared to do so quietly any longer. The ransom demanded by Henry VI was 150,000 marks of silver. To put that in some kind of context, it was roughly 2 to 3 times the annual revenue of the English crown. It was an almost inconceivable sum. It required the taxation of England, Normandy, and the other Angevin territories at a rate that generated genuine hardship across the entire population. The English church contributed its gold and silver plate. Nobles paid a quarter of their annual income. Cistercian monks, who had taken vows of poverty and owned little else, gave their year's wool clip, the single most valuable thing they possessed. The money was gathered, slowly, painfully, Across many months of 1193, it was gathered. Richard, meanwhile, was not passive. From captivity, he corresponded with his supporters, sent instructions to Eleanor, and, in a moment that reveals the extraordinary breadth of his character, composed poetry. One of his surviving compositions, written during his imprisonment, is a song in both Occitan and Old French, in which he meditates on loyalty, abandonment, and the strange education that captivity provides. It is not a bitter song, exactly. It is too clear-eyed for bitterness, but it carries a weight of feeling that no battlefield document could produce. The man who wrote it was not simply a warrior enduring confinement. He was someone thinking carefully about what the experience meant, and finding in the craft of verse a way to hold it at a distance that made it bearable. Henry VI, to further complicate matters, began negotiating with Philip of France and with John, both of whom were reportedly willing to pay the emperor to keep Richard imprisoned, or alternatively to hand him over entirely. The politics of Richard's captivity became a minor European crisis in themselves, with Eleanor and the English administration working constantly to prevent the diplomatic situation from deteriorating beyond the point where money alone could resolve it. In February of 1194, enough of the ransom had been assembled and delivered that Henry VI released his prisoner. Richard walked out of German captivity on the 4th of February, 1194. Having been held for approximately 14 months, he embraced his mother, who had traveled personally to Germany to escort him home. By every account, the reunion between Eleanor and Richard was one of genuine, unguarded emotion. The kind of moment that the formalities of medieval royal life rarely permitted, and which both of them, in their different ways, had spent a long year fearing might never come. He was free. He was 40 years old, or nearly so. He had been to the edge of the world and back, had fought a war, made a peace, survived shipwreck and imprisonment, and the slow grinding anxiety of captivity in a foreign land. And he was, from the moment he walked out of that castle, already thinking about what came next. The lion had been caged long enough. It was time to go home. And it was time, with the particular patience of a man who forgets nothing, to settle certain debts that had accumulated in his absence. There is a particular quality to the final chapter of a remarkable life, a quality that only becomes visible in retrospect, when you know how the story ends, and you can look back at the last years and see, threaded through the ordinary business of governance and war, the faint outline of a conclusion gathering itself. Richard's final years have that quality, not because they were quiet, they were anything but, and not because he seemed to sense his own ending approaching. By every indication, Richard in 1194 was as vigorous, as forward-leaning, as fundamentally oriented toward the next campaign as he had ever been. But the years between his return from captivity and his death in 1199 have a particular shape to them, a compression and intensity, as if the narrative itself was accelerating towards something it could not avoid. He arrived back in England in March of 1194 to a reception that, by contemporary accounts, bordered on euphoric. The kingdom had endured nearly 5 years of his absence, first the Crusade, then the captivity, and the popular feeling toward their king appears to have been one of genuine relief and affection rather than the more complicated emotion that prolonged absence often produces. Richard moved through England with characteristic efficiency, reasserting his authority, redistributing certain offices that John had accumulated in his absence, and demonstrating to anyone who might have harbored doubts that the man who had returned from the Holy Land and from a German prison was not diminished. He was, if anything, sharper, more certain of himself, more settled in the particular gravity that very difficult experiences confer on those who survive them intact. John, confronted with his brother's return, folded immediately. Richard, in a gesture of forgiveness that surprised many around him, and which he explained with a characteristically dry observation, that John was a child who had been led astray by bad advisors, and that he himself had made worse mistakes when young, restored his brother to favor without significant punishment. It was magnanimous. It was also perhaps the single greatest error of Richard's reign, though he could not have known it then, and it would not become fully apparent until after his death. He spent less than 2 months in England. Then he crossed to Normandy, and he never returned. The rest of his life, the 5 years that remained to him, was spent in France, fighting the war against Philip II that had been simmering for years, and that Richard now engaged with the same total commitment he had brought to the crusade, the same relentless energy, the same tactical brilliance applied now to the defense and recovery of his continental territories. He was very good at it, almost effortlessly good. Philip, who had spent Richard's captivity carefully consolidating gains in Normandy and the other Angevin territories, now found those gains systematically undone by a king who moved faster than anyone expected and fought with a controlled ferocity that the French simply could not match in the open field. Castle after castle was recovered. Territory after territory was reabsorbed. Richard built, during this period, what many military historians consider his architectural masterpiece, the fortress of Chateau Gaillard, constructed on a limestone spur above the Seine River in Normandy, designed with an ingenuity that incorporated everything he had learned from a lifetime of studying fortifications on 3 continents. It rose in under 2 years, which was, for a castle of its complexity and scale, essentially miraculous. Richard supervised its construction personally, with the same hands-on intensity he brought to everything, reportedly spending hours walking the site and adjusting the plans with the confidence of a man who had pulled apart enough enemy fortresses to understand exactly how to build one that could not be pulled apart. Chateau Gaillard was his answer to the question of how to hold Normandy against Philip indefinitely. It dominated the Seine Valley with an authority that was both military and psychological. Philip is said to have observed, upon hearing of its construction, that he would take it even if its walls were made of iron. Richard replied that he would hold it even if its walls were made of butter. It was the kind of exchange that the chroniclers loved, and that speaks, beneath the theatrical surface, to the genuine tension and mutual contempt that had replaced whatever thin crusading brotherhood had once existed between the 2 kings. The war went well for Richard. By 1198 and into 1199, the military balance had swung decisively in his favor. Philip was on the defensive. The recovered territories were being consolidated. There was, for the first time since his return, something approaching stability on the horizon. And then, in the spring of 1199, he rode to a place called Chabrol. It was, by any measure, a minor operation. A small castle in the Limousin, part of Aquitaine, the land of his childhood, whose lord had allegedly found a cache of treasure on his lands and refused to surrender it to Richard as his feudal overlord. Richard arrived to enforce the claim personally. It was the kind of thing he had done dozens of times, the routine application of authority to a local problem, and there was no particular reason to treat it as anything other than what it appeared to be. On the evening of the 25th of March, 1199, Richard walked the perimeter of the castle, inspecting the progress of the siege, watching his engineers work, without bothering to wear his chainmail. It was late in the day. The light was going. He was carrying only his shield. On the castle walls, a lone crossbowman was visible, using a frying pan as a makeshift shield against the occasional arrow from below, picking his shots with the patient economy of a man who has been doing this all day. Richard, by the account of the chronicler Roger of Hoveden, actually stopped to watch him with something approaching admiration, the reflexive appreciation of one fighting man for another's competence. The crossbowman loosed a bolt. It struck Richard in the left shoulder near the base of the neck. The wound was not immediately mortal. Richard walked back to his tent under his own power, reportedly dismissing the injury with the kind of deliberate nonchalance That was by now simply a feature of his personality. The bolt was removed, badly, by a surgeon working in inadequate light, tearing the flesh significantly in the extraction. And the wound became infected with a speed and severity that left his physicians helpless. Gangrene set in. In the medical understanding of the 12th century, there was nothing to be done. He lasted 11 days. He spent much of that time in relative composure, dictating final arrangements, summoning those he wished to see. Eleanor, his mother, his great constant, the woman who had shaped him more than anyone else alive, arrived in time to be with him at the end. He named John as his heir, a decision that would haunt the Angevin Empire for the next 2 decades. He reportedly sent for the crossbowman who had shot him, a young man named Bertrand de Gourdon, who had been captured when the castle fell, and, when the man was brought before him, forgiven him, set him free, gave him money. Richard's explanation, as recorded, was simple. He had done nothing wrong. He was defending his castle. The fact that the bolt had found its mark was fortune, not crime. The crossbowman was subsequently hanged by one of Richard's mercenary captains after the king died. Richard's mercy did not survive him. He died on the 6th of April, 1199, with Eleanor beside him. He was 41 years old. The grief that followed was, by the accounts of the chroniclers, genuine and widespread, crossing political and religious lines in a way that few deaths in the medieval period managed. Even in the Islamic world, where Saladin, who had himself died in 1193, just 4 years after Richard left the Holy Land, had been mourned with comparable depth, the news of Richard's death was received with something more than political calculation. A great figure had left the world. Both sides of the conflict that had defined the age understood that, and both sides said so. What remained was the legend, and the legend was immediate, fully formed, and essentially immune to the erosion of time. The troubadours sang of him within months. The chroniclers wrote of him with a reverence that they rarely extended to kings who had died in their beds of old age. He became, in the decades and centuries after his death, the template against which warrior kings were measured, and found, almost universally, wanting. His reputation absorbed elements that were not entirely his own, shed elements that were inconvenient, and gradually became something larger and simpler and more luminous than the actual man had been, which is how legends work, and which is, in its way, its own kind of tribute. The actual man was more interesting than the legend. He was flawed in ways the legend prefers to ignore, capable of cruelty, of political miscalculation, of a willful impatience with complexity that occasionally cost him dearly. He was a better warrior than he was a king, in the narrow administrative sense, and he knew it, and cared about it less than his subjects might have wished. He spent perhaps 6 months of his entire 10-year reign in England. He taxed his kingdom to its limits and left it, in some ways, structurally weakened by the demands he placed upon it. But he was also, and this is what the legend has always understood, even when the details blurred, genuinely extraordinary, not performed or constructed or carefully managed into greatness, but naturally, essentially, almost effortlessly extraordinary in the way that very few human beings across the long span of history have ever managed to be. He walked into rooms, and they changed. He walked onto battlefields, and they changed. He looked at a problem, a fortification, a siege, a diplomatic deadlock, a poem he wanted to write, and he brought to it a quality of intelligence and will that made the people around him feel, simply by proximity, that they were capable of more than they had believed. That quality does not die when a man dies. It persists in the accounts that survive him, in the stories told around fires and in chronicles, in the instinct of every subsequent age to reach back and find in Richard a figure who embodies something they need to believe is possible. The warrior who was also a poet, the king who was also a soldier, the man who stood at the walls of a city he could see but could not take, and covered his eyes because the sight of what he had not yet achieved was more than he could bear to look at directly. 8 centuries have passed since the crossbow bolt found its mark at Chalice Gibrol, the world Richard inhabited, its kingdoms, its hierarchies, its certainties about God and war, and the proper ordering of human life, has dissolved almost entirely, leaving only fragments and echoes. And yet the name persists, the image persists, the lion persists. Some figures are simply too vivid to fade. Richard of England, Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, was one of them. He always will be.